Candy and I are absolutely delighted to be here. I've heard a lot about this institution and the values that it upholds, and that's what's really great for me. Now, I hope everybody has kind of noticed that things are going a little awry in our country recently. And I want to talk a little bit about that. You know, our country is really a very special place. And in 1831, Alexis de Tocqueville came here, ostensibly to study the penal system here. But he said, while I'm here, I may as well look at everything. And he looked at our government and was duly impressed by the separation of powers. And then he said, let me look at their business, their economic situation. And he was duly impressed by the atmosphere that we set up that encouraged entrepreneurship and innovation. And then he said, let me look at their educational system. What can they do with these one-room schoolhouses? And he was really impressed because he could go out in the forest and he could find a mountain man. The guy could read. And the guy could tell you about the Declaration of Independence. But if you really want to be impressed, take a look at a 6th grade exit exam from 150 to 200 years ago in this country. What you were expected to know to graduate from the 6th grade, it is absolutely mind-boggling, particularly when you look at some of those man-on-the-street interviews that you see these days. They go out and they ask people just the simplest question. And they have no idea what you're talking about. I mean, you could ask them who wrote Mozart's 40th Symphony, and they wouldn't know. You know, it's just really, really sad. And but when you stop and you think about the difference and what America used to be known for, a very, very educated populace, and what's going on now, you realize we have a serious, serious problem. But then he looked at our churches, and he was very impressed by the fiery sermons that came from those pulpits that encouraged a ragtag bunch of militiamen to defeat the most powerful military force on earth, but also gave the American people a basis of morality. Now, a lot of people, they say, what are you talking about? America is not a moral nation. They had slavery, and that makes them evil, and they treat people unfairly. Now, anybody who says that is obviously ignorant, because that did not make America unique. Everybody has had to deal with slavery throughout the history of mankind. The thing that did make us unique is that we had so many people who were vehemently opposed to it that we fought a bloody civil war and lost a large portion of our population in order to get rid of that evil institution. So that's really what we should be teaching our children, rather than the propaganda that others throw upon us. And interestingly enough, some people say that all of this propaganda has really just started in the last several years. That's not true. This has been going on for a very long time. People who are history majors know that. In fact, just in the last 60 or 70 years, go back to the congressional record, January the 10th, 1963, and Congressman Herlong of Florida read into the record the 45 goals of communism in America. That's over 60 years ago. And he got them from the book called The Naked Communist by Cleon Skousen, who was an FBI agent who spent his entire career studying what communism was doing in this country. One of those goals was to gain control of the educational system in America and the teacher unions and indoctrinate the young people. And we've seen the results of that indoctrination recently on college campuses. and it's very significant. And, we have to recognize what is going on in our society. One of their other goals was to gain control of the news media and Hollywood so that you could change the culture in America and change what we thought was right and what was wrong. And you can see the things that have happened to our society when we've abandoned the traditional Judeo-Christian values that used to guide us and instead started listening to what Hollywood says is right and abandoning those principles. And it's very deleterious to us. Interestingly enough, people like Saul Alinsky in Rules for Radicals talks about these kinds of things. It's not like they're trying to hide them from us, but so many of us don't read the things or look at the things that are clearly right there for us to see and the warnings that we need. One of the reasons that the leftists, the Marxists, always try to dumb down the population like they're doing in our country is because they need people to be unaware so that they will swallow the stuff that they're putting out there. That ignorance is a great tool, particularly if you want to change a society. But people who know history, who have the facts, will be able to answer quite ably. Now, let me give you a little test. See who I'm talking about. He was born into an affluent family. He became known on the political sphere in this country while still in his 30s. He promises all kinds of things to the people free of charge. Who am I talking about? Mandani in New York. That's a very good guess, but it's not right. I'm talking about Fidel Castro. And the point being, these things follow a pattern. And when you know history, it gives you a pretty good idea of what's coming next. Well, I was a victim myself as a youngster of ignorance. I think back to being in the 5th grade. I was a terrible student in the 5th grade. All the other kids called me dummy. And I even believed that I was dumb. Only person that didn't think I was dumb was my mother. She was always saying, "Benjamin, you're much too smart to be bringing home grades like this." I brought her home anyway. But she was she was always encouraging in terms of what I should and could do. And I remember I did admire the smart kids. I just was always saying, they're the same age as I am. How can they know all this stuff? And I don't know anything. But my mother was a person who had very little in the way of education, had less than a 3rd grade education, grew up in rural Tennessee, bounced around from place to place, got married at age 13, and they moved to Detroit, where my father was a factory worker and a part-time preacher and a bigamist. And I told that story earlier this week in Utah, and nobody thought it was that strange. But obviously she thought that was pretty strange. And a divorce ensued, and we lived in dire poverty. But the worst thing was my academic performance. But I did have a way of getting back at the kids who were always teasing me and calling me stupid. I was very good at one thing, and that was getting other people kicked out of class. And I would irritate them until they were about to explode. But I would never push the last button to make them explode until we were in class and the teacher was nearby. And then I'd do it, they'd explode, the teacher would kick them out, and I would say, yeah, because I wouldn't be the only one who didn't learn anything that day. But there was this one girl in our class. Now, you all know this girl. Some of you were her, Miss Goody Two-Shoes. Everything perfect, pristine, made everybody else look like a total jerk. I said, wouldn't it be great to get her kicked out of class? There was only one problem. She was cool, calm, collected. You could not get under her skin. But I finally figured out what did it for her. And she was steaming. Oh, she was so mad. But I didn't push the last button. I waited till we were in class, and lo and behold, she sat right down in front of me. I said, the Lord is good. And as the teacher started approaching, I pushed the last button to make her explode. But she didn't explode. She just quietly turned around and said, you and me on the playground at recess. So that didn't work out that well. I became a brain surgeon and she became a professional ladies wrestler. But I did stop bothering people after that. I was quite capable of learning, but that ignorance was cured by my mother, because she had tremendous faith in God. And she asked God earnestly to show her, to give her the wisdom of how could she get her young sons to understand the importance of education, of knowledge. And I hated it at first, reading books, turning off the TV. And her friends were saying, you can't make boys stay in the house and read books. They'll grow up and they'll hate you. And I would overhear them and I would say, Mother, you know they're right. But it didn't matter. We had to do it anyway. But I actually, after a while, began to enjoy reading the books. Reading about scientists and surgeons and explorers and entrepreneurs and innovators. And as I read all of those stories, I began to understand that the person who has the most to do with what happens to you in life is you. It's not somebody else. It's not some circumstance. And every time I had 5 minutes, I was reading a book. And in the space of a year and a half, I went from the bottom of the class to the top of the class, much to the consternation of all the ones who used to tease me, who would now come to me and say, Benny, how do you work this problem? And I would say, sit at my feet, youngster, while I instruct you. I was perhaps a little obnoxious, but it sure felt good to say that to those turkeys. But think about this. I had the same brain when I was at the bottom of the class that I had at the top of the class. What does that tell you about human potential? About the fact that we are made in the image of God. Think about the human brain and its development. You have a female gamete with 23 chromosomes, a male gamete with 23 chromosomes, neither of which has the ability to become a human being. But then fertilization occurs and they combine, and now you have a zygote with 46 chromosomes, a complete map for a new human being, not part of the mother, not part of the father. And that brain begins to develop immediately. Millions of neurons every day. Later on, billions of neurons a day. That's why 9 months later, when a baby is formed and ready to be delivered, and that baby is delivered, you notice that they sleep 20 to 22 hours a day. That's because that brain is still developing so rapidly. And it continues to develop right up until your mid to late 20s. And some people it never develops, but think about that. And think about some of the implications of what I just said. You have children, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 years old, being told in some of our schools, you may not be a girl. You may not be a boy. When they have undeveloped brains. In many cases, this is pushed on children without the knowledge of their parents. And you know what that is? That's child abuse. And we have a responsibility not just to complain about it, but we need to use our spheres of influence to actually do something about it. When we see people about to be slain, Proverbs 24, verses 11 and 12 says, those who are about to be slain, did you do anything? Did you say anything? Does not God in heaven know what you did or did not do? We do have a responsibility to do something about it when we see those kinds of things happening. And there's a reason, obviously, that God gave us rules and regulations, because he made us. He knows what works. For instance, one day I was operating and the phone rings and the circulating nurse holds the phone up to my ear, and it's the university lawyers. And they said, the state of Florida is trying to attach your wages for child support. And I said, what? I said, I have 3 children and I support them very well. They said, no, there's a lady in Florida who says that you are the father of her son. And she knows where you went to college, medical school, internship, residency. She even has a picture of you in scrubs. I said, anybody can get that. On the basis of that, we got a paternity suit. And I had to get my lawyer involved, and it escalated. And then the state of Florida said, send us a blood specimen so that we can do DNA testing. And I said, wait a minute. You people, as incompetent as you are, want a specimen of my blood? I said, it'll end up in a murder scene and I'll be in jail for the rest of my life. I'm not giving you my blood. And it escalated some more. But then it just kind of fizzled and died. Because what happens is people see someone who's out and about giving talks all over the place, and they figure they've been messing around. They don't even know all the people they've been messing around with. They want to protect their reputation, so they will cough up the money. But I had a secret weapon. I knew that in my entire life, the only woman I had ever slept with was my wife. So I didn't have to scratch my head and say, was there a conference in Kansas? Never had to do that. And, God gives us rules and regulations to help us. You don't have to worry about that tap on the shoulder and somebody saying, remember that thing that happened at that conference? I know Dr. Camarada knows what I'm talking about. We don't do things like that. You don't have those kind of problems. What a difference that makes. But I can't emphasize enough that the solution, or one of the big solutions to indoctrination, and the kind of indoctrination that is detrimental to our country, is knowledge. All the knowledge that you can possibly acquire, all the reading that you can possibly do, all the perspective that you can possibly gain, and then spread that around in your sphere of influence. All of us have spheres of influence. I'm reminded of high school in Detroit. And I came to a point where I was trying to decide what college to apply to. By that time, I was a very good student. And my favorite television program was called GE College Bowl. Now, this was way before any of you, but they had 2 colleges on. Every Sunday, 4 contestants on each college team. And they would ask questions, science, math, history, geography. I was really good at all that stuff, so my goal was to be a contestant on College Bowl. And I even decided which college I would apply to based on that program. But I had a problem. in addition to science and math and history, geography, they would also ask questions about classical music and classical art. And there was no way you would learn anything about classical art at Southwestern High School in inner city Detroit. I mean, in my high school, if somebody said something about Van Gogh, they would have said, put gas in it, the van will go. They had no idea what you were talking about. So I had to make an executive decision. So I started going down to the Detroit Institute of Arts, which is one of the great art museums in the country. And I would roam through those galleries until I knew every painting, who painted it, when they died, what period it represented, listening to my portable radio, Bach, Telemann, Mozart. Kids in Detroit thought I was nuts. A black kid in Motown listening to Mozart? I tried to convince them that Motown stood for Mozart, but nobody was buying that. And I decided which college I was going to attend based on that program. I said, I'm going to apply to the college that wins the grand championship of college ball. And that year, the grand championship was between Harvard and Yale. And Yale demolished Harvard. So I didn't want to go to school with a bunch of dummies. And fortunately, Yale accepted me with a scholarship. But the year I went there was the year College Bowl went off the air. Yeah, I know, it's a sad story. But there was a good part to it, because that's where I met my wife, Candy, of 50 years now. But speaking of wives and marriage, it is so important for young people today to realize that that was the model that God created. One man, one woman, form their home, have children, support each other. We have noticed that there's a diminution in the number of people getting married, which means there's a diminution in the number of children being born. You know, in the 60s, it was 3.6, the average births per woman. Today is 1.6 births per woman. It takes 2.5 just to maintain the population. So we're going to extinguish ourselves if we don't do something about that. And remember, you know, marriage is to have in the whole till death do us part. And a lot of people, they look at stuff, they look at other people, they look at Hollywood productions, many of which are about adultery and all kinds of revenge and stuff like that. That's not necessarily the way it is. But people do need to realize that when two people get married, and they can love each other dearly, but they come from different environments. They have all kinds of differences. It's like rubbing two pieces of sandpaper together. There's a lot of friction. But what happens if you keep rubbing the sandpaper together? It becomes smooth. That's what people have to remember. Till death do us part, not until you get irritated with each other. And that's what we've allowed to predominate. And people see that, and they say, why would I want to go through that? I'm not going to get married, without really understanding the human element there. One of the reasons that we don't use our spheres of influence the way we should is because of fear. We're afraid of what other people might say, what other people might do, what other people might think. And fear can really dominate your life. When I was a youngster, I had an inordinate fear of dogs. I would not go out of the house if there was a dog nearby. I always looked around. And then I'd be going to school, and I'd be almost there, and then there'd be a dog. And I would have to turn around and go all the way around the block and come back the other way, and there'd be another dog. And I'd be late to school, and the teachers were tired of my excuses. But I met a man when I was 8 years old who changed my life. He said, if a dog doesn't think you're afraid of him, he won't bother you. He says, no matter how vicious he is, no matter how much he barks and snarls, if he doesn't think you're afraid of him, he won't bother you. I said, are you sure about this? He said, absolutely. But there was a dog down the street named Rusty. Nobody liked to go down there because Rusty was a mean dog. I said, I'm going to try this out on Rusty. So I go walking down there all confident, and Rusty sees me, and he comes running, barking, snarling, runs right up to my leg, and I said, this was a mistake. But then he sniffs my leg, and he goes back to the porch and lays down. That was the last time Rusty ever came after me. Other people would come down there, he'd bark and snarl at them, but he didn't bother with me because he wasn't going to get a reaction. We have to think about that in life because fear keeps you from doing so many different things. Now the Bible says in 2 Timothy 1:7, for God has not given you a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. Sound mind, that means common sense, not all this craziness that's going around. And we should lead in our spheres of influence with that kind of thing. And he is a present help when you need him. I remember once as a neurosurgery resident, I was on call. It was at the time of a national meeting, so all the attendings were out of town except the one that was left behind to deal with emergencies. I was on call, and a young man was brought in who had been severely beaten with a baseball bat. And he was dying. Had all these contusions, his brain was swelling, he was unconscious. And usually in that situation, the only thing that can save them is a radical procedure in which you remove part of the frontal lobe and part of the temporal lobe to create space in the skull. I had seen it done once before, but I had never done it myself. But it didn't matter because I was a resident. I couldn't take him to the operating room by myself anyway. So I called for the attending, couldn't reach him. Nurses called for the attending, couldn't reach him. Paging operator called for the attending, couldn't reach him. He was dying. Now I had a difficult decision to make. Should I risk my career, take him to the operating room, do an operation that I'd never done before without an attending? Dr. Camarada knows the consequences of that. But should I do that operation or just do the safe thing? Intubate him, put him on high-dose steroids, put him on a ventilator, and let nature take its course. It was a real dilemma. But I prayed. I asked God to give me wisdom. What was the right thing to do? And at the end of that prayer, a great calm came over me, and I knew exactly what I had to do. I had to take him to the operating room. And everything came back to me. The operation was very successful. That young man is a counselor for children these days. But I never got into any trouble. In fact, I was praised for doing the right thing. And God will always give us the courage, the knowledge to do the right thing. It makes a big difference in your life. I'm reminded of another time when a young man developed something called Van Hippel-Lindau syndrome, where they developed these very vascular tumors in the central nervous system. He developed one right in the middle of his palms, and that's an inoperable area. None of the adult neurosurgeons would touch him with a 10-foot pole. Unfortunately for me, his wife was a pediatric neurosurgery nurse who worked on the floor where all my patients were, so I couldn't escape her. And she says, "You're going to have to operate on my husband." I said, "But I'm a pediatric neurosurgeon." And she says, well, he acts like a child. And, she just wore me down. I finally said, I'll go talk to him. And I said, Craig, there's a reason nobody wants to operate on this. I said, if I operate on this, there's at least a 50-50 chance that you will die on the table. And he said, if you don't operate, there's a 100% chance I'll die. I said, that sounds pretty mature. So I took him to the operating room. All kinds of new vessels had grown in to feed the tumor. It was very difficult access, but under high magnification, I made a little slit in the side of the brainstem and used a little micro probe to see if I could feel a consistency difference, and I did. So I knew that was the capsule. And I put a micro forceps in and grabbed the capsule and then started teasing it out. And then the anesthesiologist joyfully said, I told you were going to kill him. All the evoked potentials had gone flat. The evidence of brain activity was gone. So I finished getting the tumor out. There was a very solemn mood in the operating room. And at the end, after everything was closed up, he showed no signs of brain stem or brain activity. We took him to the intensive care unit, intubated, and I prayed with his wife for a couple of hours. And then I went home. And when I came back in the morning, he was sitting up in the bed telling jokes, had been extubated, was doing just fine. And I tell that story to say that sometimes when things happen, and they're magnificent things, they're not necessarily us. They're letting ourselves be used by God. And there's almost nothing that he won't do if you're willing to submit to him. Submit to his power. Recognize that it's not you. It's a very difficult thing for people because they always think, I'm great and I'm magnificent. God talks a lot about humility and how that is such an important thing, and he talks a lot about pride and how that is something that he hates. And if you really want to be successful in life, you started already because you're at this wonderful teaching institute. But if you can take all the successes that you have and use them in the right way, think of what that means. And learn how you learn. You know, when I got to medical school, I said, this is wonderful. Since I was 8 years old, all I wanted to do is be a doctor. I've gone over the last hurdle. I'm home free. Wrong. Because on the first set of comprehensive exams, I did terribly. So badly, in fact, that I was sent to see my counselor. And he said, you seem like a very intelligent young man. I bet there are a lot of things you could do outside of medicine. He tried to encourage me to drop out of medical school. He said, you're not cut out to be a doctor. We can help you get into another discipline. I was devastated. But I prayed. I said, Lord, I've always thought you wanted to be a doctor, me to be a doctor. It's not looking that great right now. But before I finished that prayer, it popped into my head. What kind of courses have you always done very well in? And I realized I did well in courses where I did a lot of reading. I said, what kind of courses have you struggled in? And I realized I struggled in courses where I listened to a lot of boring lectures. Because I don't get anything out of boring lectures. Nothing. And I was sitting in 6 hours worth of them every day. So I made an executive decision to skip the boring lectures and to spend those 6 hours a day reading. The rest of medical school was a snap after that. And years later, when I was at my medical school as the commencement speaker, I was looking for that counselor. Because I was going to tell him he wasn't cut out to be a counselor, you know? Because there are so many people who are just negative. They can always tell you why something doesn't work, But what if they spent half that time thinking about how to help people and how to motivate people? Now, from that, do not take the advice that I said, skip your lectures. What I said is figure out what works for you. And everybody learns in a different way. And if you can manipulate your learning into what works for you, you're going to go much further and much faster. And that's really the key. And I just want to conclude by saying, with knowledge and courage, imagine what you can do. What you can do for God. What you can do for your country. What you can do in your sphere of influence. And think about all of those people who came before you in this country. People with courage. People with knowledge. People who were innovators. Who were making life better for others. Think about World War II. Think about all those young women who went into the munitions factories and were blown to bits. Did that stop the others? Absolutely not. They built more airplanes, tanks, and mortars than anybody could imagine. Think about the young men, 15, 16, 17 years of age. They lied about their age so that they could fight for our country. Think about D-Day as they approached the shores of Normandy under heavy machine gun fire. 100 dead bodies laying in the sand. 1,000 dead bodies laying in the sun. Were the others afraid? Did they turn back? Yes, they were afraid. No, they did not turn back. They stepped over those dead bodies and they overwhelmed the Axis forces, knowing in many cases that they would never see their loved ones or their homeland again. Why did they do that? Obviously, they didn't do it for themselves. They did it for you. They did it for me, so that we could live in a free and prosperous country. And now it's our turn to do it for those who are coming after us. Let's pick up the mantle, and let's be brave, and let's be knowledgeable, and let's be used by God. Thank you.